Hey everyone, welcome back to HD Reddit Reads. Today's topic is, what are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Let's get into it. This isn't really a classified document, but at one point the US government was telling people to build your own bomb shelter to protect your family. And it showed how to dig an 8-foot by 4-foot by 10-foot hole in your backyard, and if there is a nuclear threat, to get your family and go there and cover it with a door. So obviously, that wouldn't really protect anyone in the case of a nuclear attack. Later it came out that the purpose of telling the families to do that was so if there was a nuclear attack on American soil, they wouldn't have to bury as many bodies because the families dug their own graves. So yeah, not classified, but along the same disturbing stuff the US government did. I have a copy of this pamphlet. A lot of the designs seemed really stupid. The door with 2 kiddie pools filled with sand in it, one in particular. Though in its defense, that one was supposed to be in your basement. Devil Eyes. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to your kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like image with red skin, green eyes, and black markings. Basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. You should watch The Holy Mountain. In it, they talk about knowing they will never have to go to war with a country in 15 years. They make comic books and toys with a villain that looks like that other race. They also make a Paperclip type medicine, the same color as the skin of that race. All sorts of things to prepare kids to hate a particular race by the time they are of military age and the war is fought. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all the astronauts, survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached for 2 minutes and 45 seconds. They were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of this terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school, and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious shit hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate, they died astronauts. That's something to be admired in my opinion. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents that Stasi had kept on her, and found out that her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with bloodless banality. Operation Northwoods. A plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962, and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and dispose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Canadian here, the Somalian Affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s, and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be effing evil. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for the funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. I don't think it's classified yet. Project Thor, using a satellite bomber to bomb a city. Imagine a missile or bomb coming from space, and before you know it, your city is destroyed by a falling missile/bomb. It was called Rods from God. Basically, it would use kinetic energy, no explosives. It would have used a series of 2,000-pound tungsten rods to destroy and vaporize without irradiation of a nuclear bomb. It was only avoided because we signed treaties with the Russians not to weaponize space. When they performed a lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, due to her being intellectually disabled, at 23 years of age, her father arranged a prefrontal lobotomy. At the time, the procedure had only been done about 100 times in the US. It failed, leaving her unable to speak intelligibly and incapacitated. She was conscious during the operation. They say that the neurosurgeons, or whatever they're called, asked the patient to count from 10 to know when they should stop cutting down. I've heard that they stopped when her speech was incoherent. Saddest thing is she had to endure it for 64 years. All that because her family couldn't risk any political embarrassment. I notice this is more disturbing than terrifying, but I think it fits. As a part of the army, the CIA's experiments into mind control. They put electrodes into pressure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those, only a few were implanted. The ones which would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorientate themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continuously spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them the next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US government around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I highly recommend theblackvault.com. Edit. For some bright side, via the same source we got remote control of war dogs, remotely controlled scout dog, June 1974, wherein we learned that we can just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio. This is a rabbit hole case, one partially classified by the CIA until information was released 3 years after initial capture. Robert Levinson, former FBI agent, retired and began working as a private investigator, specializing in Russian crime circles. Levinson traveled to the Persian Gulf's Kish Island, which had fewer restrictions on American passports due to it being a free trade zone, to enter Iran. He was last seen March 9, 2007. For 3 years after his disappearance, the US government was adamant that he was not acting with the government party, only private PI work. After 3 years, it was confirmed that Levinson was acting as part of the CIA on an unauthorized mission to gather data on an Iranian regime. He has had a proof of life appearance in 2010. Levinson has 7 kids, one of which, with his mom, has traveled to Iran to find their dad, only to be shown plain manifestos by Iranian officials, suggesting that Levinson had left. As of 2013, if he's still alive, Levinson is the longest held American captive at 12 years. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession. A couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them, a lot of it in a pretty candid, offhand manner. There is an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they described it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is that human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known about it until recently. Not really terrifying, but effed up. Operation Paperclip, where after World War II, the US government took Nazi scientists and shipped them to America to do science. Some of them came straight from Nuremberg cells, the most noteworthy being Werner von Braun. Von Braun built the V-2 rockets with Jewish slave labor. Every day they would execute 5 of the slowest workers in front of the other workers to incentive them to work harder. Once he came to America, we shipped him to Huntsville, Alabama, where he built the Saturn V, the rocket used in the Apollo program, and got us to the moon. Operation Unthinkable. While never fully developed, it was a hypothetical UK war plan that would have started World War III, before World War II was even over. It called for Allied troops to attack Soviet Red Army at Berlin and push them out of Europe entirely. Not having the manpower to fight them alone, the plan not only relied heavily on American forces, but also called for the rearmament of German soldiers who would then fight alongside the Allies. The plan didn't get much traction because public support by that point would have been close to zero, and Americans weren't interested since they had Japan to deal with, and the war against the Soviets would likely lead to the Soviet-Japanese alliance, along other obvious issues with the plan. Not really terrifying, I suppose, but it would have been fundamentally reshaped the world that we live in today had it gone ahead. Thank you for listening, everyone. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing. It'll be greatly appreciated. And if you want to visit the original thread, I'll link it in the description. But yeah, that's it. I'll see you guys in the next one.